Hi, everyone. This is Dawood from AutoMarketplace. Today, we have a very special guest, Bhairavi Desai. And tell me if I'm mispronouncing that, please, Bhairavi. So from the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. So welcome, Bhairavi, and, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. You're saying it the South Indian way.
I know my parents are originally from Pakistan, so I have a little bit of that ability to pronounce it.
Very nice. Thank you, Dawood. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for the forum that you've created for the industry and all these issues as well.
No, thank you for saying that. So, okay, so we'll get right into it. The topic these days, as you well know, is Uber and Lyft driver lockouts. And so for people, obviously you know this, but for people who might be listening who don't know, lockouts basically is a colloquial term used for when Uber and Lyft drivers in New York City, which operates under a little bit of a lot of different regulations than the rest of the country, can't access the app when and where they want. So we've written about it. You've spoken about it at length. How would you describe why lockouts are happening?
Sure. And just, I mean, in terms of, further describing what lockouts are, you're in the middle of your shift. You could have just dropped off a passenger and you get a message saying that you're no longer online. It could be the beginning of your shift, and it can last you for hours, and you're told to basically drive. And so you're driving aimlessly. The drivers are spending that extra money, right, on that fuel. And it's a lot of frustration. I've talked to drivers where, in the beginning, when this started over a month ago, may have been 30 minutes or an hour. Now it could be as long as 4 hours. I talked to a member last night, said it was for 8 hours. Um, and again, you're just driving around aimlessly. You don't know when you're going to be put back online, in order to be available for a dispatch. I mean, why is it starting, right? That is the big question. Well, I think that there are two forces at play here. It's a combination of the oversaturation, which is a result of TLC's, massive failure to regulate this industry. And, particularly when they lifted the vehicle cap, they set all this in motion. And secondly, it's mismanagement by Uber, and really, I think a level of greed, and a real disregard for the drivers where, all this is being blamed, or really just the burden of it is being placed on the drivers' backs, even though they're not the ones responsible for these conditions. Uber knew that the TLC had set the utilization rate, where it in the actual pay rules, in the formula, it's set at 58%.
And maybe just to describe it to people, because this is a question so many drivers have. In your, how would you explain what the utilization rate is, what it's trying to achieve? Because I think a lot of it is very complicated. Number one, to
Mhm.
accept, you understand, and you have this formula. How would you describe that to a driver, even policymakers or people across the country are listening to this? Why did New York City create this utilization rate, but no other jurisdiction did? What are they trying to solve with that?
So the utilization rate is one component of the TLC regulated pay rates for app drivers. And so the pay rates are the minimum per mile and per minute Uber and Lyft must pay to drivers on every trip. And those rates are divided by what's called the utilization rate. Utilization rate is the percentage of on-app time that drivers are busy. If your utilization is 58%, that means 42% of the time you are empty. The utilization rate was, baked into the pay rates formula after a study was conducted looking at app driver, Uber Lyft driver expenses and income for 2017. It's an independent study done by the New School and a university in California, which found that over 86% of the drivers, Uber and Lyft drivers, were earning below a minimum wage, which, you know, we consider poverty. Anything below minimum wage is legally poverty in our country.
And so to build upon your point, another, how I always frame it to drive, and you're saying the same thing that I'm about to say, it's basically like you can have a minimum, you can set a minimum rate to whatever you want, but if you're not going to get, if you're idle and you're not getting paid any money when you're idle, you're not really earning a minimum wage. So as a simple example, in an hour, if the minimum rate is, you know, $30 an hour, that sounds good, but if they only give you a job 10 minutes of the hour, quite clearly you're not earning an hourly minimum rate. Is that a fair way to frame it?
Absolutely. And you know, this is part of what makes New York City unique and incredibly special. You know, so for example, it's been big headline news in Massachusetts or even in New York State, outside of New York City, when the attorney general's offices of each of these states engaged in settlements with the companies. So Massachusetts, the latest one, they said $32.50 an hour, except that it's for your engaged time only. So you're only your time with the passenger. So as you said, if you're only engaged, let's say 50% of the hour, that's $16.25 you're making, you know, but in New York, empty time is supposed to be compensated because empty time is work time. Just because a driver is empty does not mean they are not working. Drivers do not control when they're going to get a dispatch. The companies control that. So if you are left empty, you know, you are still on work time. You've made yourself available for a dispatch. They just don't have the work to give to you. And so in order to keep you paid for all of your work time, your empty time absolutely should be compensated. And that is the logic behind the utilization rate. I would like to describe, Dawood, what happened last year, right? In March 2023. So the utilization rate, you know, so it's been part of the
And just to interject, what Bhairavi is referring to is there was a TLC hearing March 1st, 2023, correct me if I'm wrong. And in that, there was this big discussion about what the percentage should be set at. And so, sorry to interrupt, I just want to give people that background.
Yes. And so during that discussion, you know, Uber had testified and said, so the TLC was proposing to, in the actual pay rate formula, to set it at 58%. But they then created a band. So meaning that in the pay rate, the formula would stay at 58% utilization as long as the utilization rate in reality, in actuality, was anywhere between 58 to 53%. So essentially that meant even if you were only busy 53% of the time, the companies could treat you as if you were busy 58% of the time. Therefore, they don't have to pay you for all of your empty time. That difference has meant in the course of a year about a $5,000 less income for a full-time typical driver. Now, at that hearing in March last year, at the TLC hearing, when TLC put this proposal out, Uber said that you know, that a band like that would be acceptable, and they said that, you know, that they could keep their utilization you know, at no less than like 50 to 53%. And therefore, they implied there would be no need for them to lock out the drivers. Now, I would argue there's never a need for them to lock out the drivers, and we should get to that. But in Uber's own words, Uber said, okay, we can deal with, you give us, this is a compromise. You give us 58% in the payrolls. We can keep drivers busy even less than that and still don't have to pay them more. This is a great day for the companies. And they said in exchange, they implied there wouldn't be any lockouts. So from that time on, you know, we expected there would be no lockouts. Two significant things happen, as we all know. TLC started to issue more plates. And so the oversaturation began. And, going back to like at some point in March or April of last year, 2023, Taxi Workers Alliance, we went to the TLC public hearing and we actually confronted the TLC chairman.
Yeah, and we have that on recording. We'll put it in a link, that interaction.
Yeah, and I remember specifically saying to Chairman Doe at the time, we said, look, you're about to issue more plates, which means each driver is going to be utilized less. In other words, they will be left empty longer. And you're doing this after you made this change in the payrolls. And so as drivers are being left empty longer, the companies don't have to keep up with that pay. And so drivers are already going to begin to lose their income.
And to build on that point, like the point you're making and I've written about this, and I totally agree with you, is that this is a pretty simple concept that kind of in New York City, we don't have to rehash the whole thing, but basically in the summer of 2018, outside of wheelchair accessible vehicles, they said there can, no more Uber. There was a cap on Uber and Lyft cars. Originally, electric vehicles were included in that, but then when another company in New York City launched that was kind of a fleet company, Revel, they said very quickly, okay, this is going to be a disaster, so that exemption is gone. But the very simple kind of policy here is that if you have there's only so much trip demand, so if you have an unlimited supply of cars, that's going to impact how much everybody can earn. And so what you're now building up to what you're referring to is in March of 2023, you had the SHL pilot,
right.
which they issued, I think it was 2,000 or 3,000 plates.
2,500.
Okay, there's 2,500 TLC plates, and yes, they're restricted from central Manhattan, but a lot of trips, as you know, are happening outside of in the outer boroughs. So that point is kind of a weird point for them to make. Then they issued 1,000 EVs in a kind of this weird auction system. So they're right there, 1,000 plus 2,500. And then the big moment, and I'll have you comment on this, is they allowed, now they're going to say, well, we couldn't have predicted that so many plates could have been issued, but which anybody in the industry knew that this was easily predictable. They allowed almost another 9,700. So if you add this all up into 2023 alone, they allowed over 12,000 FHV licenses or TLC plates, and trips obviously didn't grow by that amount. And so so now this is the question I have for you, is that the TLC is framing this that, well, we're not forcing Uber and Lyft to do that. Now, the TLC is technically, that's a true statement, that the TLC is not technically forcing Uber and Lyft to do that, but they're incentivizing Uber and Lyft to do that. So when drivers are trying to assign blame, okay, TLC, Uber and Lyft, both things can be true, is I guess what I'm trying to say, and I think you've said this. Could you, I just kind of gone on this monologue, but could you help frame why adding more TLC plates is so harmful for driver earnings?
Well, the statistics, the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, if you look at Uber's utilization, so again, the percentage of time that drivers were kept busy, right? It stayed steady from March until October. It hovered between like 58 to 56%. I think it was only like in August, maybe, started to dip, went back up, September, October, fall returns. And then in November, boom, that rate falls to 54%, almost overnight. It's the same moment in time that all the new vehicles started to hit the streets. And by the way, it's not only all these new EVs that were issued, but in addition to that, remember, as you said, because the cap does not exist on wheelchair accessible vehicles, there is also already an increase in the number of cars in 2023. And so when you look at the numbers that are publicly available, a couple of things. Utilization for each driver starts to fall beginning in November as the new cars hit the streets. The overall number of trips for Uber and Lyft as companies actually went up because that's why the companies don't mind oversaturation. They have a business model built around oversaturation because they're going to make money from every new fare. But each individual driver that is working is taking that loss. And it's important to note the other context here. 2023, this is 3 years after COVID. We still don't have full post-COVID recovery in this industry. Of course, Uber and Lyft, particularly Uber, has bounced back at a much faster rate than anybody else in the industry. But at that point, it was still only 85% of the trips returned, even though almost 100% of the vehicles and the drivers returned. And at this point, it's mind-boggling it's just stunning that at this point in time, post-COVID, we have more vehicles on the streets than we did even, compared to 2019.
And
when the work hasn't returned yet.
And the important point you're making is, I think we have to contextualize the yellow cab industry and the black, Uber and Lyft is not the only, although they've now kind of formed this duopoly in the market where they control roughly 80% of all trips. But just to give our viewers insight into the yellow cab industry, and correct me where I'm wrong here, trips are roughly recovered to about 50%, but that's not contextualizing that out of the 13,500 taxi medallions that exist, almost 400 to 4,500 of those are not even on the road. So the yellow cab is very, very far away from a recovery. And so I think another element of this, and we can build upon it, is that not only is issuing more TLC plates when Uber and Lyft are just recovering is a bad idea. The yellow cab industry, the green cab industry is, it effectively doesn't even exist anymore. Other black car industries, luxury limo, all of that. So I guess since, you've been in this, anybody who knows this industry, you've been a very powerful voice, NYTWA is very influential. In your mind, is this something that the TLC get? What in your mind is causing, we're not saying something that's very sophisticated. What is causing them to issue all of these TLC plates, and what is your thinking around that? How are they viewing, are they just not analyzing the industry correctly?
My own political reading of the situation is that there were other corporate interests at play here. The EV market clearly took hostage of this situation, and became, I think, their influence seems to be oversized. The TLC lifted the vehicle cap on, EVs for Uber and Lyft at the same time, the same day that they passed a regulation called the Green Trips Initiative, whereby gradually beginning now until 2030, Uber and Lyft will be able to dispatch trips only to vehicles that are EVs or waves. Now, the NYTWA's position was allow for natural transition. That if statistically Uber and Lyft drivers will get a new car, turn a new car every 7 years, and if you look at the TLC data, it'll show that within 7 years, if you just allow things to go naturally and you say to the drivers, okay, your next new vehicle, when you choose to buy a new vehicle, that one has to be EV or wave, TLC still would have hit their goals by 2030. But they clearly wanted to expedite that number. And I said this publicly then, and I'll say it again now. Drivers have been used to essentially create the charging station industry infrastructure, as well as to prop up the EV market. In other parts of the country, except California, where, you hear all the, EVs have been failing. You hear all the stories where like Hertz and these major dealers that are returning their vehicles. The TLC, through this regulation, created this market, ready-made market of customers for this industry. Dawood, I'm old enough to remember when this was done in the hybrid market years ago. That was for the yellow cab sector, where again the city rushed it. The cars at the time, where there were a lot of problems with the battery life, but the city rushed it and they made the requirement, they incentivized the hybrids. It's very similar to what we see happening today. And so I think that it's this other interest that motivated lifting the cap and trying to put as many EVs onto the streets as possible. Now, but let Uber and Lyft don't get a free pass here. Uber and Lyft have been part of this EV frenzy, in this industry. They've even said that they plan across the industry to shift all their dispatching to EVs, right? In the next couple of years, certainly by 2030.
One thing to add and to build upon this Uber and Lyft point, I think, and I'm kind of very much aligned with everything you're saying. When we've written about the political interests and the lobbying that you speak about, and this primarily, revolves around Revel, which is a large EV rideshare company, but now we don't have to get into Revel, but essentially they're a major player, they were a big lobbyist, and then the founder was actually at the press conference, which I found interesting when they released the TLC plates, which I don't even understand. That's not even good politics to do that. But what I find interesting about your point is that the guinea pigs, where I come out on EVs, and I'm sure you do, is that yes, long term, that is likely the future, but the guinea pigs of testing out that market, if you will, should not be individual drivers who are now, you're forcing them, you're incentivizing them for a quote unquote free TLC plate to, buy a $80,000 EV, a $60,000 EV, God forbid someone hits that car, no one has comprehensive and collision insurance and all of this stuff. So with Uber and Lyft, to build upon your point, there's a lot of innovation that they brought for sure, but when a company doesn't own any of the assets, it's very easy to dictate to other people what they should do. So Uber doesn't own a car. So I guess when you frame it like this, why do you think Uber and Lyft is pushing electric vehicle? Like, what's your thinking around that, I guess?
I haven't really, I don't have like data to back it up, but my instinctual feeling has been it's the investor class, and I don't necessarily think it's Revel. I've appreciated your reporting on this, and that was also my, initial suspicion. I do wonder if it goes up as high as like Tesla and Elon Musk, and who is certainly watching, at least on Twitter, what was happening in 2021 when TLC put the cap on EVs. So I feel like, all these higher interests have been, deep pocket interests have been watching what's happening. I don't know if like the EV market has invested into the companies and, as they're publicly traded. But clearly they have green lighted this, which in turn empowered and encouraged the TLC to go in this direction. And the reason I say they don't get that free pass goes back to the March 2023 public hearing. Yes, TLC created the oversaturation. And yes, there are loopholes I think, in the TLC's regulations and their data collection in order to effectively stop the lockouts. At the same time, Uber and Lyft know what the utilization rate rule is. Uber said it had a wait list. Either it did not manage that wait list effectively enough, or Uber miscalculated and did not put other supply controls, into their model. So for example, I wonder if many of the drivers who got the EV plates were actually drivers who were not totally brand new, but had been active, but were casually driving here and there. And then once they were able to get their own plate, were then incentivized. You went from predatory leasing to predatory financing, which I don't exactly think is a solution. I think it's a debt trap for the drivers. But now you have this big bill to pay. So it incentivizes people to work more and work longer.
And I'm glad you actually, I want to double click on that predatory, because this was, so full disclosure, and everybody knows this, I run a small leasing company for TLC, for drivers, mostly in the Uber Black, the traditional market, you can say the Uber Black luxury market. But I think there is this scenario, and now this is my opinion, and obviously there can be disagreements. There was this narrative that the way the plates were justified, and this comes to one of your suggestions on how to deal with this issue, because it is an issue. I can even written about it, that there are bad actors in this. Basically, for people who don't know, that if, I think the stats are of the roughly, well, now it's 110,000 TLC plates, or 109,000, but roughly 60 to 70% of those FHV licenses are claimed by the individual operator, and the rest are controlled by leasing companies, essentially. And then you have new markets that have arisen, like TLC plate rentals, or just renting the plate, or renting the car and the plate. And so a big complaint for a lot of drivers, and I think this is a legitimate complaint, is that, I've been driving Uber and Lyft for 5 years, and I'm stuck in this TLC plate rental. This is an unfair situation. And I want to get into how do you address those people's concerns, and now getting into some real suggestions you have ahead of your strike, which we'll get into in the 17th. How do you address those concerns, very legitimate and real concerns of those drivers who might be feeling like, they're kind of like old school taxi garage, they're trapped by a leasing company?
It's an absolute legitimate concern. This is actually a concern we've been raising since 2017. And then in 2018, when we fought, our unity campaign of Uber, Lyft, yellow livery, green cab drivers, fought for the life-saving vehicle cap. Even at that point, we were out on the streets of City Hall for like 6 months at a stretch. We called for a cap on the leasing and the financing rates. This is a cap that we won that cap on the yellow cab side after years of organizing. There's absolutely no rhyme, reason, logic for why you don't have the same TLC regulated cap on the FHV side. TLC needs to implement a cap on the leasing and the financing for FHVs, not only for Uber and Lyft drivers, but for traditional black car and livery drivers and green cab drivers as well. There needs to be a pathway for drivers who are renting to get their own plate. But that's not what the TLC created in October. If anything, by lifting the cap and allowing anybody to apply, and let's take that word individual, like let's assess that word individual for a moment. Individual could mean somebody who has a TLC license but has never driven. Could be somebody who doesn't even have a TLC license. Could be somebody who doesn't even have a DMV license. It's somebody, it could be an individual who's part of a corporation that is, literally, like an absentee landlord making an investment. They're an investor. That is not the same as an active driver who's invested their whole livelihood, not just like, money that they have to spare. And the drivers were not protected in the way that the vehicle cap was lifted. This was one of our main arguments, something that we have said also, in court and publicly, when we sued and won our temporary restraining order, which is what, thank God, put that vehicle cap back into place. Can you imagine if we had not done that? the oversaturation and the impact of the lockouts drivers are feeling right now would be like 100 times worse,
A
had
hundred,
we not.
100%. And you're
Yeah,
making a very good and simple and a very easy to understand point. You're basically saying, and I actually haven't written about this at length, but what you're saying is absolutely correct, that even if you open up the cap and you say only an individual can access it, an individual can still buy 4 cars and then run a mini fleet
yeah.
and kind of, become that. So that's actually even it's beyond corporate entity. And I think where I'm coming out on it. So I agree with, by the way, your suggestion, and to give people a little bit of background, basically what you guys want for the yellow cab industry was, a medallion is obviously a scarce asset, so that can be abused, but you guys basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, had one, I think, maybe over a decade ago saying, okay, a garage cannot charge above X amount per shift, so
Right.
regulation.
That lease cap, the garage lease cap was in place since 1997. And then, after, one of the raises, the garages started to overcharge by charging like the sales tax separately.
Oh, interesting.
There are a lot of loopholes that we fought to close up, but then also significantly in 2012, we won the lease cap on the financing for driver-owned vehicle operators. So drivers who purchase a vehicle, rent the medallion, right? And so really what FHV drivers are essentially driver-owned vehicle operators. There is no medallion. There is no other, point of capital. It's the vehicle itself. And so there is TLC can must regulate entities that are leasing or selling vehicles that are going to be used for TLC work purposes. They've done it on the yellow side, they need to do it on the FHV side, but also the way that TLC can create the pathway for drivers who are renting is to say, okay, if we release a certain number of plates, because in this industry, we have what's called natural attrition. Every year, there are people that don't renew. They end up leaving the industry, could be life changes, people that pass away, people that retire, right? People that move. And so plates are naturally released in that way already. TLC needs to analyze how many plates are released in that way. And most importantly, they need to analyze what is the state of saturation. If X number of plates are added, what will it do to driver utilization? If driver utilization falls to 50% or lower, which means you're now empty 50% of the time, what good does it do if they continue to regulate only your trip amount? For a driver, both the amount on the trip and the number of trips are necessary to have a dignified gross income. And then capping the expenses is necessary to have a dignified take-home income. And the combination of all these forces is what is necessary to have a dignified life where you're not overworking 60 to 70 hours every single week, where you're working to the point where you're risking strokes and heart attacks and just like chronic back pain, diabetes, kidney failure. This is an industry where the wealth is there. Why is it not being fairly, justly distributed to, give a quality of life to the men and women whose blood, sweat, and tears and actual sacrifice of health and life are what generates that wealth? And that is why TLC regulation is so important. It's why social responsibility in the mindset of the corporations of this industry is so important, whether they be Uber or Lyft or the medallion lending banks, or garages or even mom and pop outfits, whatever they are. They need to centralize the right of the quality of life of the drivers. But TLC has that ultimate power through regulation. And our job as a union, as the drivers, is to organize and make the companies cooperate in return.
Now, build very well. What can I say? That's very well said. And it's funny, I think, I've read that, I'm definitely, I would describe myself as a capitalist, but kind of an empathetic a capitalist. And, but it's good to have these discussions, because I think everything you said right there is very reasonable. There's
Yeah.
things need to be in balance. Like, for example, a driver who owns a medallion, he or she or they have made an investment. So, they should have some economic upside of that. At the same point, the people who might not own a medallion or a TLC plate, they need to be protected. So there's this balancing act. Now, I want you to address, because I know a lot of our audience and a lot of people in the industry, this is not necessarily my belief, I've written about it. A lot of people will say that New York Taxi Workers Alliance, and I want you to address, I'm basically giving you an opportunity to address it for the drivers out there who might be hesitant to come to your strike action, or might be hesitant to participate with NYTWA more actively. How would you address this statement that NYTWA is a yellow cab centric organization? And I want to give you the forum to address that.
I'm glad you have raised it. This has been Uber's talking point. Last year beginning in December 2022 and then January, February 2023, we organized 3 strikes of Uber drivers because Uber had gone to court to stop a desperately needed raise that our organization had fought for singularly and won. On the yellow cab side, the raise went into effect, but for Uber and Lyft, Uber stopped it by going to court. And so we went on strikes. We raised, we raised the flag, and we eventually we won that campaign. During that fight, Uber kept saying, that's the Yellow Cab Association. Well, you know what? In this association, first of all, we are a labor organization. In spirit, we are a union. We fight solely and wholly for the interests of the drivers. We are paid for by the drivers. We are run by the drivers. Those are the only interests that we protect and the only interests that we care about and we've ever fought for in our history since 1996. 70 to 80% of our membership is now Uber and Lyft drivers. We were started I started organizing in 1996. Taxi Workers Alliance was officially formed in 1998. And by 2014, many of our members, particularly lease drivers, right, who had been exploited by garages or, had been felt disrespected in their treatment, even if the leases were bearable, started and given all the bonuses that Uber, had advertised, many of our members switched from driving yellow cab to Uber and Lyft. And I'll tell you a story, Dawood. In 2015, was the first time that the city talked about a cap on the vehicle licenses. It was going to be a temporary 1-year cap because by then there are like 40,000 cars overnight. They wanted to study the impact, so on and so forth, look at the impact on driver earnings in that business model. Uber's, famously spent like millions of dollars to undo that campaign, and, that vote was lost. We were holding rallies on the steps of City Hall. When I turned around, I saw members who were driving yellow cab, who were driving Uber, Lyft, green cab, liveries, and corporate black cars. And every driver across the board talked about the impact of oversaturation. And that was very sadly reflected in what we saw with the suicides, which began in 2017. The first 2 suicides were first 2 drivers who died by suicide from the economic despair were actually livery drivers. Douglas Shifter was a longtime corporate black car driver who has to this day written in, the most damning essay about the gig economy and what it means to have had this job, which was a full-time job, a pathway to a middle-class life, be turned upside down, inside out overnight, and instead put the drivers on the race to the bottom. And so we naturally grew into who we are, which is a union that represents all the drivers across this industry. We have a unity platform. We've never engaged in a campaign which pits the drivers against each other. Why would we do that? The wealth is at the top in the hands of these companies. When we fought, for example, on the medallion side, on the debt forgiveness campaign, we targeted the lenders, we targeted the banks, the hedge funds, the private equity firms, and the credit unions that were holding that capital in the loan. We targeted them to reduce their expenses on the drivers. On the Uber and Lyft side, the money is concentrated in the hands of these companies. Uber announced in February that they would be buying back shares in the billions, which means that their investors are going to be getting money back. That money is coming off the backs of the drivers. When Uber sued to stop the Uber and Lyft driver raise in 2022, they acknowledged in their court papers that the Uber X rates they were charging the passengers had gone up by 50%. Studies have shown that while the rates that passengers are paying have gone up, the take on the commission from the drivers has also gone up. It's that complete imbalance. Our union is, and unlike, for example, the Independent Drivers Guild, which was, founded in a partnership between Uber and the Machinists Union, and was financed in the beginning by Uber. They've admitted publicly that they have a no strike clause in their private contract, which nobody's seen, but we know that much about it. The Taxi Workers Alliance, we are founded and financed majority by the drivers themselves.
You're basically a dues paying organization.
Predominantly dues paying. We are a 501c3 not for profit. We do get funding also from some foundation support, but the majority of our funding comes from the drivers themselves. And look at the campaigns that we have worked on. We are the same organization that while we fought for the vehicle cap to protect all drivers in this industry against oversaturation, we also fought to raise the pay for Uber and Lyft drivers. We fought for unemployment for Uber and Lyft drivers, which during COVID was life-saving. We are the organization through when our members filed for unemployment as employees, we fought for that and won that in the courts. And so during COVID, it meant as employees, Uber and Lyft drivers received about $1,200 in every month more in unemployment compared to drivers like yellow cab drivers and liveries and black car drivers.
No one can deny, whether your detractors or your supporters, is that you're getting a lot of stuff done. There's no doubt about that.
Yes, the $328 million settlement for Uber and Lyft drivers as well for wage theft, where, Uber and Lyft had been taking the cost of the sales tax and the black car fund surcharge out of the driver pay instead of from the passengers. And since 2015, 8.5 years, we fought for that full recovery. Like 3 federal lawsuits were filed, as well as a complaint to the state attorney general. Eventually, in November of 2023, the state attorney general announced a historic settlement of $328 million recovery for Uber and Lyft drivers as a result of the complaint filed by the Taxi Workers Alliance. And by the way, beginning July 22nd, drivers will start those payments will begin to go out to the drivers.
That's important. Okay,
breaking news.
Yeah, breaking news. So I know a lot of drivers have been waiting for that check. So basically in the next 10 to 20 days, they'll start receiving those checks.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, beginning on July 22nd, the payments will start to go out. And so drivers will start to get the payments into their hands where it
Okay,
belongs
that's
after the
that's that's
22nd.
incredible. That's incredible. I could honestly talk to you for 2 hours. You're,
I love shop talk.
incredibly knowledgeable. And there's still more stuff I want to talk about, but I want to ask you kind of maybe a weird question. Do you think what is your view of Uber and Lyft's role in the New York City TLC industry?
I mean, at this point, who can argue against the fact that, Uber is inching closer to really a monopoly. We can say it's a duopoly, but first of all, Uber and Lyft combined are what, like 80 to 90% of the trips in this
That's correct.
industry. Among those trips, Uber is like 75%, right? I don't think you can deny the level at which that service has dominated. Our issue has always been about the actual business model, the relationship between Uber and the drivers, certainly the rest of the public and the city at large, but particularly the relationship between Uber and the drivers, where the lion's share of the revenue remains in the hands of the companies, and that they at fundamentally at the heart of their business model is not only keeping drivers poor, but also oversaturating the streets. You know, um,
Is
and
it
I
is it
think
fair, is it fair to say that, and I think this is helpful, and I think more people need to hear this. You're not against the existence of Uber and Lyft, and you're certainly not you're not saying that they didn't bring innovation to the market. What you're basically saying is that sometimes they feel like rules do not apply to them, and the way they approach, is that, like, I don't want to put words in
yes,
your mouth. Is that a way
yes,
to frame
and
what you're saying?
yeah, and this is just generally, I mean, even when since day one, like we were, I mean, taxi garages and the lenders used to accuse us of, trying to topple the medallion industry. I don't care if the corporation standing in front of me is a bank, a hedge fund, Uber, Lyft, or garage or a base. What I care about fundamentally is, are they fair to the drivers? Uber and Lyft have not only come to dominate the industry, but what's important here is they've also tried, Uber and Lyft combined in 2017, they spent more on lobbyists than Walmart, Amazon, and Microsoft combined. And what they use that lobbying for is essentially to deregulate, to get rid of, eliminate rules and regulations that have been put in place to protect the drivers. Outside of our industry, there are many people that have in the labor movement, in the workers' rights movement, that have a lot of concern about how Uber operates, because by what Uber's, we're talking right now about the industry specific regulations they're trying to overturn. But generally speaking, Uber is trying to overturn also labor law. And so, when that happens, it means it's a slippery slope. They're setting a standard that now other companies are going to start to follow, and more workers in our society end up in a race to the bottom, in poverty, where you're taking on all the expenses. You get less and less share of the revenue. You take on all of the risks, and you have no protections in return. And so for Taxi Workers Alliance, whether it's been our work to cap the leases on the garage and on the yellow cab side, or the work that we've done in protecting Uber and Lyft drivers, fundamentally our work is about protecting the drivers, because every single driver has a fundamental right to a dignified life, and poverty is not a dignified life. Poverty is insecurity. It leads to heart attacks, leads to early death. Poverty means you don't get enough time to watch your kids grow up?
Where
You
is
know,
where what who can argue with what you're saying? I mean, everything you're saying is very accurate in so many different ways. In your opinion, what can Uber and because a lot of people on our platform are from Uber and Lyft, and I don't know if they've engaged you, maybe they have or haven't, or they've been dismissive. Are you arguing that, listen, we're not trying to put anybody out of business, but if when you say we, if you as the leader of this large of a large union driver advocacy group that's representing thousands of drivers, if you see 5,000 drivers complain to you that, hey, Uber's taking 40% of my fare, or Uber, the passenger's paying this, a very legitimate argument is saying, listen, our role is we're representing
yes.
our membership base, and you can hate me, you can hate us, but we're simply representing what our drivers are telling us in mass. It's not like two people are telling you this.
This is my job. That is my obligation. And the minute I stop doing that is when I should no longer have that job.
So now not to just the opposite of that is, and because I come from a finance background, will argue that, okay, fair enough, we understand that's your job, but we have shareholders and we have to answer to them. Where you're saying that that's kind of a very broken model, where if you're just thinking about shareholders and not the actual labor that's generating the profits, one way or the other, that labor is going to revolt against how you're doing business, essentially.
Absolutely. And what is a shareholder? Somebody who's invested extra money that they have. They have another job. They're not depending on this job for driving. What is a shareholder compared to a man or a woman who goes to work every day, faces 30 times more likely to be killed on this job, 80 times more likely to be robbed on this job? Your car could break down, 2 in the morning on the Bruckner, you're out on your own. There's nobody sitting next to you to protect you. The person sitting behind you could very well be the one that's put your life at risk. You're navigating traffic, which is some of the worst in any, all the global cities, across this world. You're dealing with pedestrians. You're dealing with a political infrastructure, which constantly is looking to change street design, new signs put up every day that you need to be alerted to. You're dealing with corporations that are changing how they're paying you, what they're paying you, whether they're paying you at all. And with the lockouts, whether or not you can even go to work on that very day. You have to deal with anybody with their biases sitting in that back seat, able to make a complaint about you, and with no notice, companies like Uber and Lyft will deactivate. They will fire you overnight. You could get a TLC summons in the mail that could literally cost you your income for an entire 60 to 80 hours of work a week. These are the men and women who need to be the priority in this industry. That's one of the reasons that on July 17th, we're going to do a march. It's not a motorcade. We're going to march by foot. For too long, Dawood, since I have been in this industry, the vehicle is visible. The yellow cab, for example, it's the cultural icon. You see a yellow cab, that's when you know it's New York City. For Uber and Lyft, it's the emblem of Uber. Uber itself has become a verb. What about the drivers? The drivers are the ones who created that political capital for Uber, not just the financial wealth for these companies. And so on July 17th, we're going to march by foot because people need to see the drivers, to hear the drivers.
I wouldn't get into July. I think you've perfectly led into July 17th. Could you go over, because you've very specifically outlined how you believe lockouts can end? Could you
Yes.
go over what you're, I might not agree with every single proposal. I agree with many proposals, but I think what's very appreciated is you actually lay it out, very technically. Could you go over how you believe lockouts can end and what's happening on the 17th?
Absolutely. And I should say, we never ever mobilize drivers to come out on the street, sacrifice their hard-earning time if we don't have real proposals on the table. And so to end the lockouts, we have five of them. Number one, that what TLC could do is assess what is the actual utilization right now. Could go back to the last 12 months, could look at just 2024. That needs to be further discussed, but look at what is the actual utilization rate and make that the rate in the pay formula, because otherwise drivers keep losing income. Again, the pay formula says 58%. If actual utilization, for example, is 51%, then drivers are losing as much as $7,000 of income a year, and that is not acceptable. And most importantly, these companies, after they started the lockouts, they've started to game what the actual utilization rate is. They're trying to cover it up. So the TLC cannot reward that. They should, that is now corrupted data. So look at the data that you have that's not been corrupted, reset the utilization rate according to that data, and the review period, move it to 2 years. Give them 2 years to adjust. Because one of the reasons that Uber started the lockouts in June of this year, at end of May and June in this year, is because Uber is getting ready for the TLC to review the 2024 rates, which will happen in January 2025. And so, the TLC looks at what is the year-end average and the industry-wide. So, looking at
for people so people know what you're talking about. This is the per mile and per minute rate are inflation adjusted, and you're talking about that the next review it happened in March this year, but that was, I think, a one-off, to your point, is going to happen in January this year. The one thing I just want to say, and we don't have to discuss my opinion about this, but I think, and we've written about this, where we're definitely I am definitely for the permanent per mile rate. I feel like you actually hit the nail on the head where you can game data on utilization. And so in my opinion, I feel like if the TLC focuses much more on capping supply, it's almost like it's very hard to avoid sales tax, because it's on sales, but it's easier to avoid tax on, net income. But we don't have to get into that. But do you see my point? What I'm saying, where
I'd like to reply. I'd like to reply to that. I do believe the utilization rate is important. I think that one, driver empty time should be covered. I think when pay is limited to engaged time, drivers lose out. We've seen that across the country. Secondly, I think utilization rate, along with the vehicle cap, is a tool to also protect drivers against oversaturation. And let me be more clear, it is specifically a tool to ensure that Uber and Lyft drivers themselves are made a priority for Uber and Lyft's dispatching. Because, the utilization rate that is looked at is the utilization rate for Uber and Lyft drivers. And so if Uber in its business venture wants to, cross dispatch to, others in the FHV sector, wants to have yellow cabs on the app. Well, the way that Uber and Lyft drivers protect themselves and make sure that they remain the priority for the dispatching is by having a utilization rate, which puts that obligation on the companies to keep at least their Uber and Lyft directly, Uber and Lyft drivers busy for that higher percentage of time, or to compensate them, when that time is reduced.
Actually, there's a technical point. What you're saying, it's definitely logical what you're saying. We should also make the point that the utilization rate formula, this whole formula, actually only applies, just, this obviously, but other people might know this. It only applies to bases that are doing more than 10,000 trips a day. So for the Carvels and the Dial 7s, they don't have to abide by that. Would you be against that threshold being higher? Because sometimes I feel like if the threshold is low, it actually creates a dominant position for Uber and Lyft, like to embed the duopoly, if that makes sense.
It's like it makes it harder for new entrants, for new companies to enter into.
And we don't have to go crazy into detail, but does that conceptually make sense?
I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and maybe at this point, given the level of market share that they have, it's a concept, that does make sense to review, because it's, the share of the market that particularly Uber has is just so dominant and so large that, 10,000 is a very easy threshold for them, but a difficult one for a new entrant because it's so easy for them.
And I want to give you an opportunity for another point, which is important for drivers, and then we'll get on to the other demands NYTWA has, is that Uber is actually calling right now for a standalone UR. Could you explain to drivers why that is not a good idea? And I agree that it's not a good idea. I think you're on the same page with that. Why is Uber's call for a standalone utilization rate a bad idea?
I mean, you've written about this. I think there are other folks, right, in the business analyst world who've said this. I mean, look, the reality is, out of the trips between Uber and Lyft, Uber dominates. It's 75% of the trips. If there's a standalone rate, Uber knows that Lyft's utilization is much lower. So essentially, it would mean Lyft would have to make a choice. Either Lyft would basically deactivate or fire thousands of drivers overnight in order to improve the utilization of the drivers who continue to work, or Lyft would have to raise money in order to pay drivers more on each trip. And so in basic terms, Uber, there's one fare, common fare. The passenger pays $15 on this trip. If it's, for Uber, because Uber already has a better utilization rate, Uber is able to keep more of that $15 toward its own profits because it has to pay less to the driver. A company that has lower utilization rate is going to keep less of that $15, and therefore on the even keel of that same fare, one company makes a lot more money than the other one, and so the profit margin is higher and the overall profits, are higher. And so, I mean, at this point, if it's a company specific utilization rate, a lot of, as you've written, a lot of the analysis would suggest that Lyft would be fundamentally changed, even to the point of being bankrupted, or just, existentially transformed, let's say.
Yeah, and that's an important point that you made right there. What are so the UR, what you're asking in terms of UR is that it be, right now it's done on a yearly basis. That's actually, I would be surprised why Uber and Lyft would be against that. You're basically saying you would give them 2 years rather than 1 year.
It's a compromise on our part, right? And 2 years, because at the moment we need to adjust to the oversaturation. That's a reality. We have to deal with the reality, which is there is oversaturation. Uber's utilization has basically hovered at 54% since November, except January, it was a low dip. I think the March and April, May, June numbers were back to at or at least close to 54%. Now, in order for industry-wide to be at 53%, which is the floor that the companies are looking for, Lyft would have to be at least 50%. Here's my problem. 53%, which is the goal of the companies, does not benefit the drivers, because what it means is that they're keeping you busy 53% of the time, but in the payroll they only have to pay you at the 58% marker, which means it's a difference of $5,000 per year that drivers would continue to lose. But at this point, even, how much can we trust the data on what actual utilization is, given they're using the lockouts to manipulate that data? And so the TLC needs to respond to that by, I think, enacting the actual utilization rate for the non-corrupted data that they do have. If you make the next review 2 years, then the companies have that extended period of time to readjust, and you have natural attrition because drivers leave this industry. As people start to leave this industry, you don't need to engage in lockouts. As drivers start to leave this industry naturally on their own, the numbers get readjusted. You don't need to do lockouts. You don't need to do unfair deactivations. It gives everybody breathing room in the immediate moment, and it lets us extend kind of the time period for the adjustments. And at the same time, the drivers are not cheated because they will be paid at what the actual utilization is at the moment. I'm sure the companies wouldn't mind that 2-year review period, but getting the utilization to reflect what the actual rate is, that's where the fight is. And that's why the drivers need to hit the streets on July 17th. It's a difference of $5,000, $7,000, even $10,000 of income. Some of that's already been left on the table because of the way the utilization rule was changed last year, and then other money that they're now losing out on because of the actual lockouts. So besides this adjustment, a fix to the utilization rule, the second would be strengthening the FHV vehicle cap. Limit the new plates only to renters and only issue them if the utilization would not fall. If you can see that the utilization will remain at, whatever the pay rate is reflected to be, 58%, 55%, I would say, 58 to 60%, drivers should be busy in their
You're
shift.
almost saying like this shouldn't be subjective. This should almost be like formulaic.
Standard.
It's
Absolutely. This is a business.
Yeah.
This is a business, this is an industry, everything runs on numbers, right? And the problem has been that from the driver's side, the actual human driver is turned into a number. Now we want to keep our humanity, but we want our numbers. Our numbers are the right to earn a dignified living, right to work less hours. We want those numbers also on the table because that's what gets conveniently forgotten. So if you readjust the utilization rate and you maintain the cap, and so the oversaturation gets slowly adjusted and as plates are turned over, right? As there's that natural attrition, those new plates can go to the drivers who are currently renting. So you set up a pathway, you don't lock them out. But connected to that,
the taxi medallion, it'll be interesting because you might get some heat from that suggestion from the taxi medallion industry. But would you say that, well, because sometimes I do feel for the taxi medallion industry in the sense they'll say like, what is this TLC plate business? And I don't own a tax medallion at all, but they'll say, I paid, the numbers, I paid whatever I paid in the hundreds of thousands of dollars plus, and I paid for a right. How in the world, I'm not saying this is my opinion, but I'm straw manning tax medallion owner's opinion. Why is anybody getting the right I paid $200,000 for free? How would you address that?
I mean, listen, there is such deep pain, a very understandable sense of pain and betrayal, that owner drivers, individual medallion owners have, and they're absolutely right to feel that way because the city did betray them. The city made a promise. They advertised to the drivers. They inflated the value. and then they deflated the value by allowing in an unlimited of vehicles overnight and deregulating this industry. There are thousands of owner drivers who depended on that medallion value for their retirement. They're now in the twilight of their years, where instead of thinking about retirement, they're looking at bankruptcy. They're looking at higher debt. They're looking, they're looking at having lost like the dreams that they had envisioned, not just for their children but for their grandchildren, and dreams that were envisioned that they worked for. They put in the 60 to 70, 80 hours. They were subject to assault and harassment on the job. They worked the weekends and holidays, and after all of that, people were robbed. And that's why we fought so hard for the debt forgiveness campaign. But I understand the debt forgiveness campaign was still it was a limited victory. It was a victory for mainly the drivers that are going to continue to work. It's a victory for those who had been deep in debt and would have had like their house more, their houses and their savings, all of that at risk. That risk has now been removed from their shoulders onto the city guarantee. We still have about 300 loans, by the way, that we're still working to get under the city guarantee. And so we're all the
Like
restructuring.
a lender's not participating in
There's
the
still
MRP.
there's still lenders that we're working on. We're not going to give up that fight until we get all of our beloved members out of that grip of debt. But the thing is, Dawood, there's a reality that in this industry, there's already 60,000 drivers working every single day for Uber and Lyft. And when you talk to our owner driver members, they don't begrudge the right of a fellow driver to have a dignified life, to live without poverty, to live in security. The fight is not with each other. The dream of Uber and their agents is to create, this fight with each other. I'm sorry, I have to share a quick story with you.
No, go for
So,
it.
for the July 17th action, we our members have been like they're doing this phenomenal job of making videos and posting on Facebook and on TikTok. And there's a Latino brother who posted and he said, something to the effect of, our Arab and Muslim drivers are going to save us from Uber and Lyft. He was responding to a number of videos that our Arab and Muslim members had made, agitating, mobilizing, organizing drivers to come out on July 17th. And it reminded me of one of the most profound moments for me. After 9/11, drivers were really at risk, and like so many of our members were subject to hate crimes. Taxis overnight with people carved like "FU Arab" onto parked cars. I remember on a Coney Island Avenue in Brooklyn, like every single taxi at one point, they had let the air out of the tire. They punctured every tire. There's graffiti. Drivers would find graffiti in the back seat after they had dropped off a passenger, realizing they just escaped like, injury through with a knife. Many drivers at that point started to turn over their hack license so you couldn't see their name, or just take the license out, because it got to the point where, especially our Muslim brothers and sisters, passengers would immediately ask, "Where are you from? What religion are you?" And I remember we had a group of Latino members who, out of solidarity, they took their hack license out. And because they knew their Muslim brothers were doing it, and out of that respect and solidarity, they also did it to normalize it. They knew the risk. If they were pulled over by the TLC, they would get a summons. They risked that summons to have the back of their fellow driver. I have seen that kind of a like a deeply rooted love and solidarity between drivers. I know drivers love sharing the stories of road rage and where, people might be, cursing each other out, yelling at each other. But besides the road rage, I cannot tell you how many beautiful moments of that deep solidarity I have seen between drivers. So our medallion owner drivers who have experienced crisis and debt have that sense of humanity. They're not trying to spread it to other drivers in this industry. They're trying to end it for themselves and fundamentally across this industry. That has been the unity campaign and the spirit of our union. So I
And
think capping.
to your point, I think, and I'm always of this opinion, both everybody can coexist. It's good for
People did
there's more
coexist.
than enough business to go around.
Yes.
I also think, for and you're not paying me to say this or anything, but I think when people obviously been doing this for more than 2 decades, specifically in this industry, you're somewhat of a living legend in the driver advocacy community in this industry and in New York City, is that if you were truly, and I'll just say this in your defense, if you were truly 100% taxi medallion, you would not even make the suggestion that drivers who are renting should be able to get a handed in TLC plate. I can tell you that. Someone who's 100% in the tax medallion industry wouldn't make that suggestion, but you're trying to make this balance, and it's actually refreshing to hear that. And in terms of, so you're basically saying fix utilization, you're saying enforce the gosh darn TLC cap for once. Don't add 10,000 plates again, please, in 2024.
Right.
You also are saying that we went over this to cap the rental and financing costs. And I believe the way they did it for the medallion, correct me if I'm wrong, is you had a hearing, you went over expenses. It was just, I know a lot of lease, fleets who I know of and who listen to us will be like, well, what does that mean? You're saying we'll do it in a sophisticated manner. We'll break down expenses. There'll be a debate and discussion, I assume. You're also saying unfair deactivation, stop that. I think that's a huge point. And then I think this is kind of flying under the radar. You're actually saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that of the fare, and excluding the sales tax and the black card fund fee and all of that stuff, you're saying that Uber and Lyft should not be able to take more than 15% of the fare. Is that correct?
That's right. On each trip, drivers should be paid whatever is higher, either 85% of the fare or 100% of the TLC regulated rate. So you fix the pay rates, and then you entitle drivers on each trip whichever amount is higher, because as I was saying earlier, so many studies are showing that Uber, for example, has raised the rates on the passengers. Uber itself has acknowledged that in court. But at the same time, through upfront pricing, right, which Uber started like around 2017, 2018. We were opposed to it back then, by the way. We knew that the minute upfront pricing started, Uber was separating out. They were divorcing, driver income from the passenger cost. And by doing that, slowly take more and more share of that passenger fare. And so what that has meant is that, see, the TLC minimum pay rates are supposed to be the floor. Floor means you can't go below it. You can't earn less than this, because anything below it, you are in crisis poverty. I grew up working poor. I would argue minimum wage is still part of it's functional poverty. You survive, but life is supposed to be more than that. You go below it, that's serious crisis. That's evictions, homelessness, hunger, multiple jobs, all of that. Okay. But so the pay rates should be that floor so you don't fall below. There should be no ceiling. There should be no maximum on how much drivers can earn, not in a business model that has dynamic pricing. If you're going to have dynamic pricing where you can change the price, it's not a fixed regulated meter, you can change the pricing in order to adjust for your, your business interest, your profit margins. Well, you need to redistribute, share some of that with the workers who will allow you to earn those margins.
How would you answer to Uber? This is not my argument, but let's say I'm Uber. I'll say, well, if we do that, trip demand is going to go down. How would you, that's a very common argument. How would you address that?
Where was that concern for Uber when Uber X rates were increased by 50% after 2019? Studies across the country have shown that they are constantly adjusting those rates. I mean, we're not saying they have to charge passengers more. We're not saying that. We're saying when you do charge passengers more, you cannot just keep that only for yourself.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. That's a very fair point. And on this point, that's also, people should know, because I think it's important for, I'm a very detail oriented, as you are too. There's also a New York State sales tax. There's a black car fund fee. So that's like 11% right there. There's congestion surcharges. There's all of these other things. So you're saying that in reality, even if you limit to that 85% of the fare, a driver still, if you take the government take rate plus the company's take rate, the driver in reality is still left with like 70% of the fare, effectively, something like that.
And when they're surging, or on some trips, drivers are left with 50%. We've seen it as low as 50%. I've seen examples even 40%. That's not acceptable. The driver is the one responsible for all the expenses, the labor, the service. They are promoting brand Uber. And by the way, there's the data that drivers generate by just driving around. That gets monetized in this world. Uber has access to all that data. Drivers aren't getting a penny for any of that. The promotion that they do through their customer service, they're not getting any extra money for that. Look at the lockouts. You're a diamond driver. You're a driver since, for the last 10 years that has faithfully worked for this company and made its riches. You're still being subject to the lockouts. There is no retirement plan in this industry. There's no sense of seniority in this industry. And so what you are able, and this is an industry where you end up working longer hours, partly in order to cover both rush hours, right? That's how a driver day to day maximizes their time. You work both rush hours, because that's how you're going to make more money each day. Because you have these expenses that are weekly, some that are monthly, but mostly that are weekly, you also end up working a longer week. Many drivers in this industry are majority drivers are immigrant. Among them, many of our brothers and sisters are alone in this country. They travel back home sometimes 4 months at a time. For the other 8 months, they work 6 to 7 days, like 10, 12, 14 hours every day. With all that labor, all that contribution, how on earth are they left with such low pay, without any job security, with such little savings and no retirement? Drivers must be able to earn a dignified living on every single fare across this industry. We're concentrating right now on Uber and Lyft drivers, but the same value applies whether you're driving for a livery base or, yellow cab, green cab, or a corporate black car. The money exists in this industry for far too long. It has been monopolized by the corporations, by the lending institutions, by the dealers, by the insurance companies, by the repair shops.
I'm beginning to understand why you're such an effective. All these points are very legitimate. There's no doubt about it. And I think how I'm taking this, hearing you speak, is, everybody else seems to be getting rich and making money. And the guys at the kind of the first principles of it, the guys who are men, men and women who are making the money, they get the short end of the stick. It seems like more
Yeah,
often.
we, I'd like, I wish I could remember at the moment off the top of my head, but this Uber CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, does fine for himself. Tony West, who happens to be Vice President Kamala Harris's brother-in-law, works for Uber, does fine for himself. The investors that are getting money back from Uber right now are doing fine for themselves. It's the drivers who actually make all this wealth possible that are struggling. And the lockouts are a significant financial crisis, but honestly, Dawood, in many ways, they're insult on top of injury. That how do you say to the drivers that have created all this wealth for you, are not responsible for the oversaturation created by the TLC, are not responsible for the mismanagement by the companies, are the ones that are just in a dignified way trying to make ends meet every single day? How do you send, they do a drop off, they're in an area that's surging, and they're still not able to come back online. It's like these are games that are being played. Like the companies are trying to move drivers like they're pieces, like they're pawns on a chess set in this game between the companies with each other, their games with the regulator, their games with their investors. They're trying to move drivers. Well, drivers are human beings. We need dignity to live.
Yeah, you
We
don't want
can't.
you want an algorithm as a boss, or you don't want Wall Street as a boss, as a driver. And we shouldn't forget that the TLC also, as you've already mentioned, bears responsibility for primarily, it seems like, and I think we agree with this, in terms of enforcing the FHV license cap. That's one element of it that's oversaturated the market, which is just almost like it's not even a subject, it's just objective in the data. It's just a fact. It's not even controversial. And then also kind of being outsmarted and not, thinking through all of these things. Now, I hope you come back, on one of these podcasts again. It's been my honor, speaking with you. You've done so much over the years. In conclusion for this podcast, when is the July? So we've gone over like what you're calling for on July 17th. And we're going to include this when we distribute this video in our newsletter and the YouTube. Where is the meetup on July 17th? What time? Where do people meet? And what's going on?
So Wednesday, July 17th, 1 p.m. sharp at Broadway and Murray, right outside City Hall. We will be gathering there, holding a rally there. And, as the city council, the mayor across the street, the state senators, assembly members also have their offices. And from there, we will be marching on Broadway, downtown toward Uber's headquarters. And so we're asking all Uber and Lyft drivers, this is a ready to strike march. Join us at 1 p.m. Broadway and Murray outside City Hall to march from City Hall to Uber's headquarters. We need to end the lockouts. We need to raise driver pay. We need to win regulations and laws to protect the drivers and, put drivers back on the pathway toward a middle-class life, which their labor deserves and has earned on its own.
Well, Bhairavi, thank you so much for taking the time. We're going to distribute this today. So when people see this, it's as a today thing, because, Wednesday, July 17th is coming up. But I just want to thank you very much for your time. I think many drivers are very appreciative of everything you're doing. And hopefully we can do this again.
Thank you so much. I look forward to that.